Hola, les damos la bienvenida a una nueva función del Festival Internacional del Cine de Mar del Plata. En este caso, una nueva función de la Competencia Estados Alterados. Vamos a estar hablando con Theo Anthony, estamos muy contentos de hablar con él, director de la película All Lights Everywhere, parte de nuestra competencia Alterados. Bienvenido, Theo.
Thanks so much for having me, Santiago. It's great to be here.
La primera pregunta era algo muy notorio en la película, que es que hemos presenciado muchas imágenes de violencia policial con estos dispositivos que incluís en la película y sin embargo no lo vemos, no las vemos a esas imágenes en la película y me pareció una decisión muy interesante y quería saber si nos podías comentar un poco de cómo llegaste a esta decisión.
I'm glad that you're actually leading with this question because I feel like I don't get to talk about it a lot. I think that when people think of body camera images, they think of really violent, brutal attacks by the police, people being shot. And I think that it's really important to understand that obviously those things really happen. But for this film, we decided that we were making a film about the perpetrators and not the victims. I think that as a filmmaker who has used violence in images before, as I've gotten older, I think I've come to sort of doubt the need to re-traumatize an audience for the sake of proving that a traumatic event existed. In fact, I think that the force of the traumatic image and just reopening these wounds actually can distract us from understanding a wider context of how these images work. So for us, it was really important to turn the camera around and sort of to look at the frame of the image and understand that in addition to the explicit violence that happens within the frame, there's all sorts of violence that's happening outside the frame at all times. So that was our strategy at every point throughout the film.
Y pensando en cómo lograste tener tanto acceso a estas compañías como Axon, quería saber cómo fue el diálogo que tuviste con esas compañías para lograr tanto acceso y poder incluirlos en la película hablando tan libremente.
I think we were able to connect really earnestly with companies like Axon, with companies like the spy plane, the persistent surveillance solutions, with the Baltimore Police Department, because we were honestly interested in the technology that they were presenting. I think that we were always trying to connect at that level of enthusiasm and meet each other at the levels of that enthusiasm to sort of provoke them into these really honest performances of how excited they were, because we were excited too in the way that they contained all these really specific questions. And so I think that we are not I'm not like a gotcha journalist. I'm not someone who corners my subjects with a whole list of questions, because I think that's like ultimately really unfair. When you have the camera, you have so much power. I think obviously the subjects have a lot of power too, but it's very easy to make someone look stupid. And we didn't think that was good for the argument that we wanted to make. And actually, in looking at everything that Steve said with the Axon sections, we realized that the clearest point that we wanted to make about Axon, the clearest, most distilled version of the argument, was actually said by Axon themselves. And so we watched every single interview that Steve had ever done. We watched every single commercial they'd ever put out. And so when we approached them, we made sure that we were always approaching them through their own language. And we realized that if we could get them to replicate that in front of our camera, we would get what we wanted. So I think it was, and I think that that's like I obviously I disagree with Steve about a lot of things. I'm very interested in body cameras. For you guys all saw the film, so you know why. But Steve is also very excited about body cameras for different reasons and has different feelings about it. But we were actually able to meet at that level of enthusiasm about the same thing, and I think that you really see that on the screen.
La película habla de las jerarquías, de roles de poder en la creación de las imágenes, por lo que parece natural que te incluyas en la película. Podemos verte como parte de distintos planos o apareces en distintos momentos de la película. Pero la pregunta sería, ¿cómo formar parte de esa película? ¿Cómo decidiste cuáles iban a ser tus apariciones, de qué manera iban a ser y cuánto de vos íbamos a poder ver en la película?
Yeah, I did not want to be in the film. It was like not a plan. I think that, if you look at the footage that's in there, it's like me before, like setting up the camera, setting up the subjects, all these things that we just had in the rough footage that we pulled out later. I think a lot of things happened. I think that I think two main things. One, as we dove deeper into the subject, looking at how a certain power, police and different, forms of surveillance assert their power through removing any trace of themselves from the image and presenting that image as the objective image. It's like that kind of God trick. We realized that it would be hypocritical if we did the same thing as filmmakers, and that if I, not as the, this godlike documentary director making the film, was creating these images, but I was a person with a very particular body and perspective and place and obviously race, making this film. So that felt like it had to be in there, because if we're holding up a mirror to all of these other institutions of power, of policing, of surveillance, of corporations, why not also be able to, face ourselves in that same mirror? I think the second thing that happened that was really ongoing. But last summer, I'm sure, this was after the murder of George Floyd, and, there's this uprising in America and throughout the world. And I think like the entire world was a part of that moment. I think we were looking at this film as talking about these really, really important issues of surveillance, and particularly racialized surveillance, against Black and brown people in America, but, used across, it's, the dynamics are different, in all across the world, but in America, specifically talking about, violence against Black and brown people. We felt that it was our responsibility if we were going to be making a film about this, especially as white filmmakers, that we had an obligation to bring the film back down to earth a little bit and to make it as concrete as possible. I think before the events of last summer, it was sort of drifting in this very ethereal science fiction space where it never really touched the ground. And so I think after going through last summer and really thinking about our position, we made that decision to bring myself back into it, and to sort of as a way of grounding it, and also as a way of like relaying or sort of giving more concrete information about body cameras and how they work, and not letting it be some abstract thing. So those are the two big main things that happened.
Continuando con esta cuestión del punto de vista de la película, en tus películas justamente siempre incluís alguna forma de voice-over, de voz en off, pero no necesariamente eso representa, entiendo, tu perspectiva, o por lo menos no lo hace de una manera pedagógica. E incluso en esta película está esa voz en off, pero lo hace como, o lo que sería la voz en off, aparece en forma de subtítulos. quería que nos cuentes un poco cómo pensaste esta voz.
Yeah, I think that I'm really interested in like the aesthetics of truth, like what we do in documentaries to make them appear more truthful. I think that we do, you know, the interviews, like the lit studios, the director who's always off screen, the voiceovers, all of these things are such like a very specific arbitrary language that give the documentary format like this, you know, supposed higher indexical relation to truth of what actually happened, you know? And it's so naturalized that we don't even think about it. So I think that, like, for me, I'm always trying to like find out what those really arbitrary choices are and to sort of like invert them and say, well, actually, what if all of these things that we took to be signifiers of a close relation to truth were actually the opposite and were things that made us doubt the truth of the image. So specifically with voiceover, voiceover has a very long history, you know, in being used. I think most, just crudely speaking, it conveys a certain amount of authority, right? Someone's speaking to you and you're supposed to really think and believe what they mean. And you also don't see them most of the time. And I think that ties in so closely with a lot of my work of like these sort of, you know, not what you see, but what you don't see of who is framing these images and who are making these decisions behind the scenes. And so I like to use voiceover as something that carries all that weight of authority, but also is constantly undercutting itself. That's making you doubt that authority. So I've done that in all three films. You know, maybe I won't do it anymore, but I think with this film in particular, I was really interested in having multiple voices and further like delineating the stories coming into your head. At one point we had like 3 or 4 voices and it was way too much. But very roughly speaking, the voice that you're hearing is speaking to what's inside the frame. It's analyzing what's in front of you. And the subtext is speaking about what's outside the frame, what you don't see, or bringing an outside context. So I feel like a lot of my inspirations for how I bring together my films is like just from reading, and I've always been curious about how to bring footnotes into a viewing experience, and these kind of director's subtitles were a way of us to kind of have like footnotes to the film. So it was helpful for me to like sort of to have a voice that really was literally my voice, and also in the subtitles, but also have another voice projected through the voiceover artist that was like just that. It was a projection. It was a fictional character that allowed me some fictional space to sort of to play with. So I think that I like the fact that of having these two voices that don't have to agree with each other or do different things.
Continuando con lo que nos decís de las notas al pie, la película en los créditos incluye una bibliografía, lo que es una decisión muy interesante. Y quería saber si hubo algún texto que hayas leído en el proceso de hacer la película y que haya cambiado justamente tu proceso, tu forma de ver algo de lo que estabas haciendo en la película y que haya afectado la creación de lo que vimos, no solamente en esa previa de idear y de diseñar la película.
Yeah, absolutely. I could go on for a long time, but I'd say like the top like 3 or 4 books are Techniques of the Observer by Jonathan Crary. It's like it's a really incredible book that looks at how so many of the ideas and desires and technological innovations that we associate with photography were actually in place before photography came along. So I think that kind of inverts this idea of history of like, we're just going from one technological innovation to another. We go from the iPod, we go to the iPhone, and the iPhone to the iPad, like all these geniuses come with these objects that just come along. And actually, like these objects, these technological innovations express these already existing desires and these moments in history that these objects just sort of like seize. So it's a really beautiful book, a lot of art history in there. I'd say the other two books are like Simone Brown's Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness. It is a really great, really well-researched book on histories of surveillance, but actually really tying that together with like histories of race, particularly in America, but also with the transatlantic slave trade, that, you can't talk about these histories of surveillance without also talking about the slave trade, because they are inseparable histories, which I think is something that is missing in a lot of, if Foucault is like the discipline and punish, and so much of his work is really brought surveillance studies to the foreground, it really is missing a lot of like racial analysis and the way in which race intersects. There's this quote that Simone Brown says that, if the light of Foucault's panopticon shines, on an unsuspecting public, maybe the light shines more brightly on some than others, and she's talking that we actually need to talk about who this surveillance has been directed at throughout history. So it's a mind-blowing book. And I guess just the last one, I could go on and on and on like this. It's like a tenth of a second by Jimena Canales. She, in a similar vein of Jonathan Crary, does a sort of analysis of a lot of early photographic history and how it tied in with like a lot of colonial expeditions and also military. And so a lot of those through lines of camera and military development came from her, and she does incredible work. She's an incredible historian of science. So Simone Brown, Jimena Canales, and Jonathan Crary. Those are just like I could go on and on and on. But I will say really quickly, and I'm glad you brought up the bibliography, is that we're working on releasing a website that's like an interactive bibliography for the film that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So be sure to be looking out for that. It's just it's essentially like footnotes for the entire film that you can scrub through the film and see every single image, where it came from, every single quote, everything. Like if you're interested in learning more about the transit of Venus, it'll point you out there. So we've been working really hard on it, and it's a really great way of like just paying our gratitude and homage to all the people who inspired the film, because it really, there's such a large depth of research already out there that we were so lucky to stand on top of. So that'll be coming out soon.
Genial. La película hace una especie de historia de la mirada, una historiografía desde los orígenes del cine hasta la actualidad. Y hay algo muy interesante, que es que la película se detiene e incluye momentos en los que vemos como si pasearas por las pestañas de un explorador de internet, en los que vemos los videos de Axon, por ejemplo, y es como un paisaje muy habitual para nuestros ojos hoy en día. Sin embargo, es raro que se incluya en una película, y quería que nos cuentes un poco cómo pensaste en esta estética de escritorio de computadora.
Yeah, I'm certainly not the first. There's like a lot of really amazing work. I'm thinking of the work of like Kevin B. Lee, who is like he's an incredible filmmaker, writer, but also has really pioneered, maybe that's a bad word, but like really is a master of the desktop cinema genre. But I think just in general, so many of my inspirations for my films come from outside the world of film. I think that like they come from music videos, they come from video games, they come from reading. I wouldn't say that like I'm like a cinephile, and I love films, but it's not I'm so inspired by other, media, and I have found that documentary is such a generous container for all of these interests and to sort of collide and speak to each other. I think that modern audiences, just to be alive right now, is like you have to be so visually literate, and not just visually, but orally. We are so naturalized in watching a video, pausing it, reading an article, answering a phone call, typing out a text. Like, we write more words per day than at any time in history. Like, people are writing right now more than they ever have. And so it's just so invisible to us that we don't really think about it. And I think that I give my audiences a lot of faith in being able to bring that experience into the world of a film, things that might be seen as experimental, like a 3D video game or a desktop navigating through it. Like, that's the spaces we encounter every day. That's our landscape. And so I think that it's not like I'm not putting it in there as a gimmick. I'm actually just trying to be as faithful as possible as to what I see the modern landscape is, because it's not just what you read or what you come across, but it's also how you come across it. Obviously the medium is the message. And I think that in my films, like I'm very obsessive with, like, if I find something, if it's in an archive, it's really important that I just have that very specific archival image in there. And if I'm coming across it on a desktop window, I want to have the desktop window in there. And if I'm trying to make a point, if I'm thinking of it through a Premiere window, I want to have the Adobe Premiere window in there, because I think that how we are coming across this information is dictating the message just as much as what the information is. In fact, it sculpts the information. But so yeah, I'm just like, I think that a lot of people would see my films as like experimental, and I'm fine with that. I think that's like a very generous label. It's just a label, but something that really encourages me is like when I'm able to connect with like younger viewers who just get it, who just watch TikTok for like 3 or 4 hours a day, and like it doesn't feel messy or like at all to them. Like, they just get it. Like, we live such fractured lives, and I think that like my editing is like just driven by that experience. I'm like inspired by the way in which modern life edits itself all the time in front of us. When you have like that moment where you're like saying something and then you open up your Instagram and it like, you're talking about like going to the gym, and then you open up your Instagram and then like you get an ad for a gym membership, or like, all that stuff is like editing. If you think like it's really creepy, obviously, but like that kind of synchronicity and like, your editing is like this way of like creating a bridge of meaning between two seemingly disparate things, right? Like you're creating meaning together. This is like, obviously like 101 stuff, but like the modern world with all its algorithms, with all its different devices and screens, is constantly throwing up new ways of creating meaning. And I'm really inspired by that. And I want to have that in my films. So that's a long answer, but yeah.
No, es genial. Y creo que cubrís bastante de algo que te quería preguntar, y espero que no sea muy abstracta la pregunta, pero como decís, la película incluye muchas imágenes desprolijas o imperfectas, captadas con todo tipo de dispositivos, donde el objetivo no parece ser buscar imágenes bellas, digamos. Yo creo que la película es increíble y tiene su propia forma de belleza, sin duda, pero no tiene esa forma tradicional de embellecer las imágenes, y quería preguntarte cómo se maneja esa tentación de decir, bueno, esta es la estética de mi trabajo, y quizá incluye imágenes que son eso, imperfectas o desprolijas, y no hacen tanto lucir el trabajo del director desde ese costado.
Yeah, I think that there were many times, many, many times when we were making this film where we said, here's the clean, beautiful way to do this, and then here's the more honest way to do it. And I was very lucky to have a team of collaborators that were always down to do the more honest way. It would have been so much easier to not include that final scene. It would have been so much easier to cut us out of the community meeting. It would have been so much easier just to, like, goes on and on and on. Like, all of these decisions, we found that in that messiness, in these things that escaped our perfect aesthetic framing of the world, that was like the point, you know, those things that were outside of our frame, that were constantly challenging us, that were constantly making us think about ourselves, about the world. And so we were, that was, I mean, there's like a really, as I said before, like there was this film that was this very ethereal, abstract sci-fi film about technology, you know, that totally ignored the real world effects of that were really messy and confusing and anything. And I think it's just like, I try to embrace complexity. I try to understand nuance and context. And I think things are really complicated. And I, at all stages, really try to resist any form of reduction. And if these beautiful images like require a certain amount of reduction that is also tied in with a lot of violence and in leaving people out, or sort of not mentioning that the victims of this technology, I will always take messy complexity over clean beauty. You know, I think that's it's like an anesthetized image. There's like no, it's like it's been wiped clean with like antibacterial or something. You know, it's just like, yeah, it's clean, but you killed everything on it. You know, it's just so I don't know. I was just very lucky that I had a team that was really, really excited and drawn to those areas of ambiguity and messiness and things that, you know, brought our own methodology into question.
El final de la película, ese epílogo que incluís con los estudiantes que están aprendiendo a filmar pilotos, nos apunta como esta otra película que no fue, o todavía no fue, no sucedió, y sin embargo se introduce en este epílogo. ¿Nos podés contar un poquito más de ese proceso, de cómo formaba parte del proyecto y por qué termina siendo esta última sección?
Yeah, I mean, it was, we filmed with a classroom in Northwest Baltimore called Frederick Douglass High School. It's like a really legendary high school in the area, a lot of incredible alumni and people have come out of it. And they have a film program called the RAMP, Recording Arts and Media Production Program, that was run by this wonderful teacher named Dr. Patterson, Dr. Pat. And we spent a long time, we knew that we were making this film that was about all of these violent histories of the gays and all these violent connections between image making and colonial histories. And, you know, it was obviously a lot of other stuff happens with images too. Images are ways of imagining new worlds, of generating new outcomes, of representing, of telling, you know, a story, all those things, you know, that are really positive. And, you know, that's a strain going way back to the beginning of, you know, cinema, of like people like Frederick Douglass, who was like the most photographed man of the 19th century, you know, talking about like the world making potential of photography. So that was always something that was guiding us. And as we got deeper into making this film, you know, we had this incredible experience where we were in that classroom and we were helping them make their film. And they were, you know, that whole section was a collaboration where I was holding the camera, we'd pass it around the classroom, everyone was filming each other, they'd use my camera to make their films, and they did. They made their own project. That's, you know, it's like 3 or 4, almost 3.5 years ago at this point. So they're all in college, or, you know, they are way past high school now. So they made their project and we had a really great experience. And, you know, I think when we were coming up with the film, we thought that it was so important to show, you know, that there were all these other narratives that weren't contained by the story that we were telling. I think you mentioned before that we were telling like a historiography of the gays. And I think we are, but also like I don't want to say that that's the only history of photography, because there's so many other histories that are happening all the time that aren't recent. Like, you know, some of the earliest portrait photographers in America, you know, making daguerreotypes, all these things were Black photographers in New Orleans, you know, and like, so that history of like, there's so many other histories like happening, and we didn't ever want to say this is the only one. As we were making the film, we realized that we were telling the story of this one very particular history, and the students, even though they were constantly resisting that, you know, that they were pushing, it was a separate story, that they were pushing back against that framing. We felt that like, ultimately when we got to the end, it was unfair to place students, kids, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds in our frame for the sake of resisting it. And because what they were doing in that classroom wasn't, you know, it's a classroom of of Black kids in Northwest Baltimore. You know, like they are obviously, like, to be Black in America is to be targeted by police, is to be targeted by society. But like, why are we only reinforcing that positioning by placing them back in our film, when that's actually not a classroom of victims at all? Like, those are like doctors, those are musicians, those are lawyers, like they're doing something else entirely, you know? And so we spent 2 years talking about this, and we felt that what I said, we didn't want to place them back in a frame that they weren't in a position to resist while they were working in that classroom. So we felt in the end that to also take that away, you know, the conversations that we had about over those 2 years shaped the entire film of who we were, what the film was, what we wanted to do with it. Even though they're not in the film, those conversations that we had with the students, that we had with ourselves, shaped the entire film. And so we felt that to erase them entirely was a different form of erasure that we didn't want to do either. So as an epilogue, it's this acknowledgement of a failure, of our own failed frame, but also I hope that it's a departure, you know, and an acknowledgement that this whole world that we just built up earlier in the film is just totally arbitrary and flawed anyway. So there's so much else going on, and there's so many other histories happening all the time. And we really hoped that that was just the beginning of something else that's not our film to make, you know? So that was a really long answer. It was a lot of questioning and a lot of things. And a lot of people aren't happy with our decision. They don't get it. And we knew that, but I know that in my heart, we had a really incredible time with those kids. And I know that we made a film for them that's not in my film, because they were under no obligation to make anything for me, you know? So they made their own film. They had an experience. They got experience on a set. We had an amazing time. And that's something that was an incredible experience, regardless of whether it makes the final cut of my film. So, that's our thinking on that.
Bueno, creo que podemos decir que en estos 3 o 4 años que pasaron entre que filmaste varias cosas y hoy, pasaron algunas cosas, sucedieron algunas cosas importantes. Vos mencionabas, por supuesto, las protestas en torno a los abusos policiales. Por supuesto, ocurrió esta pandemia que todavía estamos transitando, y te quería preguntar cómo afectó eso la producción de la película.
Yeah, I think practically speaking, we were done filming. I mean, this film took 5 years. We were done filming in the very last thing that we shot, which was the press conference for the spy plane at the very end. That was like December 19th, 2019. So that was the very last thing we shot. And then we were in a place where it was, you know, I was just editing for, you know, and the pandemic, I didn't, you know, for the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, I couldn't touch a computer, and I was just kind of doing other stuff, which was great. But yeah, so we were done production, and we just, you know, we've just been editing over the duration of the pandemic. I think there's a larger conceptual question that we felt throughout the course of this film, which was, you know, I started making this film in 2016, and body cameras were really hot. They were just going all, you know, they were in the news and lots of people were talking about it. And we were worried at like different times, like, oh, are people even going to care anymore, you know, in a few years? And, you know, Axon is always putting out new products. They put out like 2 or 3 new cameras, like while we're making the film. And we had this impulse to like, be like, oh, we should go film that. We should go film that. We should go back out to Arizona and do one more thing. And we kind of had to have a very serious like sit down with ourselves where we reminded ourselves that we weren't journalists, that we weren't there to tell like the breaking news. Obviously that's a really important job, but that's just not what we were doing. We weren't chasing headlines in any way. So it was actually really important for us to take a step back and look at more of these long view or more eternal questions that guide all of these things. You know, as you've seen in the film, the questions that drive body cameras are very old, and you know, the questions of surveillance and policing are very old. But at the same time, when we, you know, with the uprising last summer, rather than just sort of say, oh, we're not going to have any connection to the present whatsoever, we tried to strike a balance to have like, okay, well, yeah, like these questions are very old, but the way in which it manifests, there are some very particular things about it in terms of the policy and the way that technology works. So that was part of the process of like bringing it back down to earth so that people had something to grasp instead of just like these eternal conceptual questions. So yeah, I think I'm interested in these longer view questions. I'm interested in like really taking my time to understand a subject. And that doesn't always work, like, you know, in today's media environment. But I was happy that we had the chance to really take our time with this one because I think it really needed it.
Bueno, Theo, te agradezco muchísimo por formar parte de esta edición del festival y por tomarte el tiempo para hacer esta charla. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for the great question, Santiago.